Hey guys, it's me, Halloween Dan, and today I'm doing a video which kind of returns to something I've done before, but in an ever so slightly different way. And yes, I am going to get a little bit historical, so just a warning. A couple of years ago, I started a series where I talked about Halloween characters and why we use them for Halloween. And in those videos, there was about 3 of them, I focused mostly on the Universal monsters and how they, although they are standalone characters with literary history and obviously movie history, they have become quintessential Halloween characters. And I focused mostly on Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy. That's where I ended the series, because although there are plenty more Universal monsters to talk about, and we could argue that many of them are great Halloween characters, I felt like those 3 were the quintessential Halloween characters that have fully been adopted into Halloween, and that without Halloween just really wouldn't feel like Halloween at all. And so today I wanted to sort of jump back into this, but in a slightly different way, because I'm going to move away from the Universal monsters, and instead I'm just going to focus more on purely Halloween characters. Characters that are so embedded into the bedrock of what Halloween is and how we celebrate it, that not only would Halloween not really feel like itself if we didn't have them, but I question as to whether Halloween would even exist if not for these characters. These are characters that are just all-encompassing. They're more a part of how we are as humans and how we see the world than they are a one standalone character. And the character I want to focus on today has prehistory, modern history. It's been in movies, films, TV programs, books, you name it. This character's been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and is the, for me, at least one of the quintessential Halloween characters. So join me, gather around the cauldron, grab hold of your broomsticks, and let's talk about that classic Halloween character, the witch. Yeah, I just did that. So before we get too far into this and too historical, I just want to point out that this is really talking about the stereotypical witch that we all perceive for Halloween, with the trappings of what that witch encompasses. I'm not really focusing too much on the historical witch or the Wiccans and pagans and people like that, though I will be briefly talking about them just as a bit of background history here. So this isn't me saying this is what witches are. I understand there are plenty of people out there who consider themselves white witches. This is not really talking about you as such. This is talking about the stereotype, if you like, of what witches are and how we use them at Halloween. But first of all, we do need to travel back in time a little bit. We need to get a little bit historical, and we need to fundamentally understand what a witch is. Now, I don't think anyone really needs to be told what a witch is, but the real version of what a witch is might not be what you expect it to be. Just like Halloween itself, witchcraft and the idea of what a witch is truly an ancient one. Halloween, in its modern interpretation, has had many stages. Back in the Middle Ages, it was All Hallows Eve, the eve before the Saints' Days, a big feast day festival kind of event. And then way before that, before the Roman times, in prehistory, it was the event we've all just come to use the term of Samhain, a much more ancient pagan event, which was essentially a harvest festival, but depending on where you were in the world, it could even have been like a New Year's Eve type event with the crossing of one year into the next. A very special time of year, particularly for the Celts. But one of the most special features about Samhain was that this night at the end of October was not only a night to celebrate the harvest and all that kind of stuff with bonfires and the likes, but it was also considered to be that night where the veil between the world of the dead and the world of the living was at its thinnest. And if you had the right conduit, you could bring these worlds together. And that conduit to open up these doors and bring these worlds together was what we would call a witch. Yeah, ancient Halloween was very witchy. Witches back then, though the word witch didn't exist at this point in history, but we're gonna use that term because it's the only one we really fully understand, were not what we think of. They were just kind of wise people within the community. Sometimes men, but often women. And they were usually just wise people. They were the people you'd go to if you had a stomachache and you needed to know what herbs to take to make you feel better. They were the people who would tell you what time of year to plant your crops or what time to harvest them. They were the local doctor. They were the local midwife. And they were also the local shaman or priest who had this ability to commune with the afterworld. And so on nights like Samhain would have been incredibly important to their local communities. And though we don't know a huge amount about what people were honestly doing at this time in history and how they generally celebrated, we do know that these people existed and this was a general belief, and that people who were witches at this time period were more central to how communities worked at this time. But we also know that at least in some parts of the world, particularly in the Greek world, people who had these abilities, who could speak to the afterworld and who had certain amounts of wisdom, certainly were mistrusted. We know this from stories, one of my personal favourites, the Greek story of Perseus, who has to defeat the Kraken to save his betrothed Princess Andromeda. And to do so, he has to seek out a group of wise women known as the Greys. In later stories and adaptations, they're referred to as the Stygian witches, but because the word witch didn't really exist in this time period, that isn't what they were called, and they were more commonly known as the Greys. These were three crone-like women who lived in the middle of nowhere, and they had the ability of foresight. They had a magical eye. They were completely blind, but they had this eye that not only allowed them to see the present, but the past and the future, which was why so many people sought them out and why Perseus is seeking them out too. The only problem with these crones is that they are also cannibals, or at least they're depicted as cannibals a few times in some later stories, and they would eat people who came to seek them out for their wisdom. And so even in quite ancient history, this idea of older crone-like women living alone but with abilities and wisdoms, and you could even argue magic, but being distrusting of them and fearing them is a very real, palpable thing. And this theme continues on through history. By the time that the Christian age begins in Europe and Christianity is spreading, witches, or people who the society at that time thought of as witches, were being cast out, particularly by the church, because they were mistrusted and the church wanted the monopoly on who got the power of God and who could really talk to the afterworld and so on and so forth. It's in this period of time, I think in like the 9th century or something, that we actually start to hear the word witch for the first times in the form of Wicca, which is a Saxon word which basically just means someone who's got magical powers. But often the undertone to this word is also a negative one and could also come to mean someone who had evil intent and also was a bit mischievous with those powers. But for much of the medieval period, witches are just kind of lonely old women, often in craggy spots, that should just be kept away from. And if you do come too close to them, then maybe you can dunk them in a river and see if they really are a witch or not. But generally, they were just kind of left to their own devices and used as ways to keep people out of places that you didn't really want them to go to. It's not really until the sort of late Middle Ages and into the 1600s and 1700s that the depiction of what we think of as a witch starts to formulate. And I think two of the most witchy things that we think of as a quintessential witch items are the cauldron and the broomstick. But why? All the way back to Shakespearean times, one of the most famous visions of witches that we have is from the story of Macbeth, where the witches are gathered around their cauldron brewing their spell.
Trouble, trouble, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
It's probably one of the most influential witch spell lines from any time period and story. And this picture, this imagery of the crones gathered around a cauldron brewing spells is just the most witchy image we have that still exists to this day. Broomsticks too become an incredibly important feature of what a witch is, as early back as the Middle Age period and into modern times. But why do we have these things? Why do we think of these things as things that witches have? Well, it's kind of a bit sexist.
Shut up, you sexist pig!
Women often were depicted as witches. It's just that simple. Basically, the church historically kind of distrusted women and thought that women should be seen and not heard, hanging about in the house, domestic goddesses and all that kind of nonsense. And any free-thinking woman who had a little bit of wisdom about her was someone that should definitely be mistrusted and cast out as a witch. And so what happens is, at some point during the Middle Ages, things that are associated with women during this time period become the perfect edifices of what a witch is. So during this time period, of course, cauldrons and broomsticks are just domestic household items. Most households had cauldrons for cooking with, and most households had broomsticks. And because during this time period a woman's place was in the home, these domestic items become associated with rambunctious women who are obviously being turned to the devil. Suddenly, the broomstick, this household implement, becomes a way for a witch to escape the household and to do mischief. There are other connotations to do with the broomstick that are all a little bit rated 18, if you know what I mean. But generally, the connotation is that the broomstick was just a way for the woman to escape the household, and that was, no, you shouldn't be doing that, you naughty, rambunctious woman. The cauldron, too, is a domestic implement. It's a cooking implement, and yet, in witches, it's used to cast spells, to cause trouble, possibly even to poison people. So these domestic implements that are associated with womanhood during this period of time are, in the case of witches, turned into something evil and satanic, because at this time period as well, anyone who was a witch was also in league with the devil. Even the humble black cat becomes associated with witches during this time period. Cats were often domestic pets that would catch mice in the home and stuff like that. And also they were creatures that tended to like to go out at night and prowl the streets. So they would kind of become associated as almost like the animal version of witches, and witches' familiars often, because they would go out into the night almost as spies for the witches. And so it's this same association that leads to the idea that black cats in particular are bad luck, a stereotype which is incredibly harsh and wrong and is definitely connected to this idea of witchcraft. By the time we're reaching the sort of late 1700s, these are the implements that we think of as quintessentially witch implements: the broomstick, the cauldron, the black cat. But there is one more thing that we think of as the most witchy thing of all, and that is the pointed hat. Now, there are several theories as to where the pointed hat comes from and what that really is, and I'm not gonna lie to you, all of them are pretty bad. Some say that the pointed hat was kind of an anti-Semitic thing because Jews would often wear pointed hats, or in certain parts of Europe were forced to wear pointed hats to sort of cast them out and point them out. And so the black pointed hat becomes sort of attributed to witches because they're almost seen as the same kind of thing by that society at that time. Some say that it's to do with Quakers, as the pointed hat was a traditional woman's headgear for Quakers, and this was like an anti-Quaker kind of a thing. No one knows for certain, and there's lots of different theories, but one way or another, this pointed hat, which was worn by certain people in that society at that time, becomes attributed to witches. By the 20th century, all these imagery that we've built up throughout the centuries has solidified as one picture: the classic black cape, black pointed hat, ugly old crone, flying on a broomstick, casting spells in her cauldron. All that has solidified, and the witch becomes a cemented figure within the celebration of Halloween. And throughout the 20th century, we saw reinvention of the witch. Witches were brought into a whole host of new stories, new movies, new films, but one of them, more than any other, kind of also added to the stereotype that we use for witches. And that's the Wizard of Oz. Now, there are some that say that witches were still depicted with green skin long before the Wizard of Oz ever came out, because green was always associated with kind of rotting flesh and kind of evil stuff. So witches were often portrayed with a greenish hue to their skin. But it's the Wizard of Oz that solidifies this idea of the green-skinned witch. into the modern mind. And you think about most kids who dress up as witches for Halloween, they all get out the green face paint because it just seems like the most witchy colour there is. In honesty, the Wicked Witch of the West, who's portrayed as this black-hatted, black-caped, green-faced witch who flies around on a broomstick, in the original story of The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West isn't green, or at least she's not described as green. The choice to make her green fully was in the hands of the movie producers who produced The Wizard of Oz, partly because green was often associated with evil and evil witchcraft, but also because green as a colour just popped in the new multicolour movies that were being produced at this time, and they really wanted the witch to stand out on the screen. Because of that, the green-skinned witch has become a quintessential witch item, and let's face it, it just looks good. Throughout the latter part of the 20th century, the witch was reinvented again and again and again. Everything from the really cool goth witches of The Craft to the more traditional witches of Hocus Pocus, and even the teenage witch of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, one of my favourites. Witches are just part of our culture. They're constantly reinvented, they're reeled out every Halloween, we put them into movies, we put them into films. We like to think we know the witch, but they're constantly being reinvented, and I'm glad that they do because they're one of my favourite characters. Yet despite all the many reinventions and despite certain parts of society reclaiming the idea of what a witch is and making it less of a negative and more of a positive, every Halloween you will see people wearing their pointed hats, you'll see them with their broomsticks, you'll see them carrying their cauldrons and wearing their black outfits. That is a witch for many people, and will always remain a witch for many people. And regardless of whether you like the stereotype or you don't, that imagery, that ancient imagery of what the witch is, will remain, and it will be forever a part of how we all celebrate Halloween. And personally, I'm here for it. Anyway, guys, I hope I haven't bored you too much with my history lesson and talking about witches today. I just really wanted to get into the depth idea of what a witch is and why we use this character at Halloween. I hope some of this was vaguely interesting for you. I just like this kind of stuff. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next one. Keep it spooky. Bye.